Okay, so this one's been a challenge, so we'll see just how much of this we can get out. So basically, we were talking about the cerebral hemispheres. And so basically your primary motor and your primary sensory areas are located around the central sulcus. So the central sulcus is basically this area right in here. And so your primary motor area is this little gyrus right there, the blue one. Your primary sensory is going to be the orange one. So just on flanking that central sulcus. And so you have in that motor area, you have like facial muscles, things like that. And so damage in these motor areas can create things like cerebral palsy, weakness in the arms and legs, and so forth. And so here's kind of like what it looks like. In your motor area, you can see that along your gyrus, you have different types of functionalities. For instance, swallowing is down here on this little wrinkle, salivation, facial expressions, thumbs and fingers, forearm, your arms, your thigh, your legs, things like that kind of go down into the sulcus itself. Sensory wise, it's broken up in the same attitude, only now you're doing sensory information instead of motor information. So ultimately, the somatosensory area, which is just behind the central sulcus, is relaying sensory information of the skin and the skeletal muscles. And that's basically in charge of all that. And so this is essentially your sensory locality. One of the things that you'll also have is in the sensory area of the cortex is the reception areas for your senses, for instance, for taste and vision, hearing, smell, things like that. For instance, you have your primary taste area is going to be located in your parietal lobe. Your visual cortex typically is in your occipital lobe. Your auditory area is in your temporal lobe, and your olfactory is in your frontal lobe. So these are processing areas for all of your senses. And so ultimately where the integration occurs, this is also where your memories are stored. So this is one of the reasons why you can log memories along with sensory stimulation. So your premotor area is typically anterior to the primary motor area, so just one gyrus away. And so this organizes your motor functions. And so your somatosensory association area, which is posterior to that somatosensory gyrus, is on the just one gyrus away. And so this will help you to process your information, sensory information from your skin and muscles. So you can see how you kind of basically just sort of organize your cerebral cortex into these major motor and sensory areas. Now let's take a look at your sensory locality. So visual sensory is going to be in your occipital lobe. This basically will associate new visual information. And so your recognition and things of that nature. So your auditory associational areas in your temporal lobe, this basically allows you to associate new sounds with different types of memories. So notice you're doing associations, not discrete collection, but associations. In your frontal lobe, you're going to have your olfactory. And so in your prefrontal area, you're going to have different types of things like for areas for reasoning, planning, critical thinking. These are executive functions. This is in your frontal lobe. Wernicke's area is the posterior part of the temporal lobe, of the left temporal lobe. This is basically where you're able to get your verbal skills, so your written and spoken intelligence. Broca's area, which is basically in the left frontal area, this is essentially your primary motor area that stimulates muscles, especially for speaking and writing. So oftentimes you want to connect these two so you can recognize and understand written and spoken word, but then also be able to produce them. What about central white matter? So basically myelination occurs in the white matter of the brain as they grow up through the descending tract. From the primary motor areas will communicate with the lower brain centers, oftentimes through these myelinated areas. So basically, if you have a distance to travel for your message, you typically will have a myelinated strategy. And so these will go to the lower brain centers. So you have a little bit of a distance to travel in order to get these lower brain centers. And you'll connect these with these myelinated structures. So tracks within the cerebrum oftentimes will take information from different sensory motor association areas back and forth. So these are basically just pathways between brain regions. The corpus callosum contains tracks, a lot of tracks that conjoins both hemispheres, right and left hemispheres. So this is how you coordinate your two hemispheres. Now, within your motor and sensory areas, you're essentially going to have a mass of gray matter called the basal nuclei. So the basal nuclei are essentially masses of gray matter, or gray matter is basically processing areas that's deep inside the white matter, and this basically will integrate your motor commands to ensure that you have proper muscle groups that are being stimulated or inhibited to make sure you get coordinated and smooth muscle contraction. Parkinson's disease, for instance, is associated with the degeneration oftentimes of specific basal nuclei sections. And so that's where you get that discoordination of muscle contraction. So that's basically what's happening in Parkinson's disease. The hypothalamus, thalamus, and the pineal gland are regions of your cortex, your diencephalon specifically, that is associated with the integration of your endocrine system. For instance, hypothalamus is in control of the pituitary gland, and this is going to be the top dog associated with your endocrine system. However, it also does other things. It basically is regulating your hunger, your sleep, your thirst, your body temperature, your thermostat in your body, and of course your water balance. So these are really big jobs that your hypothalamus has to do. So these are really functional things. So you have to make sure you get all these right. So your hypothalamus is in charge of those really critical functions. Your thalamus basically are two giant masses of gray matter. One receives sensory input, except the sense of smell. That's coming through olfactory. And then it sends it on to the appropriate areas of the cerebrum for integration. Your pineal gland secretes a hormone called melatonin, which is kind of like our natural our sleeping pill. So this basically regulates day rhythm, and it basically makes us drowsy. So your circadian rhythms is regulated by melatonin as well as your drowsiness. The cerebellum is underneath the occipital lobe, separated from the brainstem by the fourth ventricle. So the fourth ventricle is smashed between the cerebellum and the brainstem. And it's mostly white matter in a tree-like pattern called the arborvitae. It actually looks like a tree. That's what we call it. And so this white matter is over on top of this is a thin gray matter sheet that forms little complex folds. And we'll see this actually when we take a look at that again. This basically is important in your posture and your balance. And so that's an important component. So it produces smooth, coordinated, voluntary movements. Without the cerebellum, you would have very jerky, discoordinated types of movements. The brainstem, which is a big one, is going to be composed of a couple major pieces, which we sketched out previously, right? So you're going to have your midbrain, your pons, and your medulla oblongata. Now, the midbrain basically is the relay station between the cerebrum and the spinal cord or the cerebellum. So basically, this is communicating or sort of directing traffic between those major pieces. Has a lot of reflex centers in it for visual stimulus, auditory, and tactile stimuli as well. The pons basically is the one that's communicating between the cerebellum and the rest of the central nervous system. While the medulla oblongata essentially regulates things like breathing. It also has centers that coordinates head movements, visual response, auditory stimuli, things like that. So a lot of your autonomic systems are on the medulla oblongata. So for instance, you have reflex centers that will regulate things like heartbeat, breathing, vasoconstriction, that's blood pressure. You also have reflex centers on your brainstem, that's your medulla oblongata, that are in control of reflexive vomiting, coughing, sneezing, hiccuping, swallowing. So a lot of these sort of maintenance reflexes that we associate with are wired directly to the medulla oblongata. And so you have tracks that basically move from the medulla oblongata into the spinal cord and up into the spinal cord if it's an ascending track. So the brainstem also has what's called a reticular formation, which is a network of nuclei, so basically masses of gray matter essentially, and fibers that basically go through the brainstem itself. And the major component of the reticulating activating system, or the RAS system, which is essentially your arousal of the cerebrum and causes a person to be alert. So this is your kind of arousal, not just your circadian rhythm, but your arousal, your ability to become conscious and alert. That's your RAS system that's happening in your reticular formation. You can also filter out unnecessary information. So for instance, you can study with the TV on, so you can ignore the TV while paying attention to your studies. And so this allows you to be able to kind of focus on one thing and not the other. General anesthetics, for instance, will suppress this, and so it'll basically put you into a state of unconsciousness. So basically it'll deregulate or kind of disconnect your arousal stimulus. Severe injury can cause this as well. So for instance, a severe head trauma that causes coma is essentially affecting this arousal mechanism for this RAS system. So that's kind of what it looks like. So here you can see your thalamus, basically, which is communicating to all regions of the brain, the cerebral cortex, your reticular formation, which is basically communicating up into the cerebral cortex, its arousal information, and the ascending sensory tracts that are basically sending that information up through those tracts. And here you can see in the cerebellum, that little tree-like white matter arbor vitae. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look then at the limbic system. The limbic system is essentially the seat of our emotions. It's something that humans have a very sophisticated development of, other animals not so much. But this also gives us our higher mental functions as well, so reasoning and memory. Now, in the limbic system, we have a structure called the amygdala and the hippocampus. So the amygdala is essentially an area that creates a sensation of fear. So if you are stimulating your amygdala, you're basically creating a fear sensation. And the hippocampus is basically the one in charge of learning and memory. And so this is basically how you log your learning and your memory. And so here you can see your thalamus, your corpus callosum up here. Your hippocampus and your amygdala are kind of down here, further down here, be just behind your pituitary. So your amygdala is right here behind your pituitary, and connected to that is your hippocampus. And so these are regions of the brain that are very, very important. Notice you see a connection between your olfactory tract, that is to say your sense of smell, and your amygdala. So this allows us to be able to associate different emotions, fear, for instance, with the sense of smell. And you can see how you have different tracts as it kind of wraps up around the corpus callosum. These different tracts are basically connected to different areas of the brain. And so you can see you're coordinating these different areas of the brain with the hippocampus and with the amygdala. And so in memory, basically, this is essentially your ability to recall events from the past versus learning is your ability to retain and use past memories in an integrated sort of a way. So when you take a look at memory and learning, you have a couple of different types, right? So first of all, you have short-term memory, which is generally stored in the prefrontal area. And so it's just like a temporary holding bin for memory. Long-term memory is basically we have memorized facts. It's basically embedded deeply into your brain. Semantic memory is typically when you're memorizing or you've memorized numbers or words. Episodic memory is when you've memorized persons or events, moments in time, perhaps, or in your life. Skill memory is basically when you're performing motor activities and you remember how to perform them. So it's a skill development. So long-term versus short in your retrieval, right? This is helpful for exams. So visual memories are typically stored in your visual association area that's in the occipital region of your brain. Sounds are generally stored in your auditory association in your brain. The hippocampus is like a bridge point between the memories that are stored and where they're used, right? So basically, this is essentially the connector that connects the memory with its use. The amygdala basically is essentially fear, and it's associated with danger, associating danger with different memories. For instance, if I saw a lion come into my room, my amygdala would be associating fear and danger with that lion because that lion's going to eat me. Long-term potential, basically, this is essentially what happens when the synapses have been used intensively. They release more neurotransmitters than before. And so essentially what it's kind of creating is it's basically wearing out a pathway. That becomes stable through constant use. It's kind of like basically, wearing a hole in your favorite pants. It's because of common usage. And so ultimately, this will allow you to sort of store this particular memory in this particular sequence of synapses and allow you to be able to recall that. Of course, at the heart of all of that is your amygdala and your hippocampus in particular. Your hippocampus is basically taking all these inputs, like your auditory inputs, your visual inputs, your smell inputs, and it's integrating them together through a system of integrated synaptic pathways that are burned and then basically create a memory. And then it kind of files that memory. So language and speech basically is semantic memory, essentially seeing, hearing words, basically is a sensory thing. So you have to have a situation where you have the occipital association where you see the word, and your temporal lobes where you're hearing the word respectively. And so ultimately, the speech component is, remember, linked to Broca's area, which is your ability to write and read. And then the comprehension of speech, to hear it, is the Wernicke's area. So the two are connected together in your total verbal intelligence. So that's kind of what it looks like. So basically, this is essentially words seen in the visual cortex, basically somebody who is reading. So you can see the visual cortex is being stimulated as they read. And then information is interpreted by the Wernicke's area as you read that word and you think about it. And then the Broca's area is transformed as you begin to speak it and write it. And then the transferal of Broca's to the primary motor area basically goes from your ability to perceive and to understand or to conceptualize something you want to write to the actual motor process of actually writing it. So you can see that when you read and then you write out what you written or what you read, it engages different areas of your brain and it burns more pathways for your brain so you can learn more. So oftentimes when you take a look at language and speech, the left hemisphere is oftentimes dedicated to language functions. So split brain syndrome is basically where you have loss of communication between those two hemispheres. So you have one side of your brain doing one thing and the other side of the brain is not involved in the process. So basically the left hemisphere will be involved in your verbal intelligence, your logic and your analysis, and your rationale. The right side will be typically nonverbal or visual spatial intelligence, your intuition, and your creativity. So that's your left and right side dedicated regions of your brain. So now let's go ahead and take a look at your peripheral nervous system. We're going to be taking a look at cranial nerves aside from the brain. And of course, this is basically coming from the brain. That's why they're called cranial nerves. And the spinal nerves, which are coming from the spinal cord, we already saw those. And ganglia, which are basically collections of nerve cell bodies, which are processing centers. So when you take a look then at the structure of a nerve, you can see that basically what you have is a bundle of different things. So here's your nerve fiber, which is basically bundled up into a larger bundle of these nerve fibers, which is what we're seeing here microscopically. So each little circle is a nerve fiber or a nerve cell, if you will, an axon. And then you have a bundle of nerve fibers in a larger structure, and then a bundle of these bundles in what becomes a spinal or a cranial nerve. So that's basically our structure. It looks very similar to the way muscle fibers and muscle fascicles are arranged as well. When we start with the cranial nerves, there's 12 different pairs of cranial nerves. They all basically are attached to the brain They're coming from the brain. We typically refer to them by Roman numerals and a particular name. Oftentimes, they typically will have either only sensory fibers, that's one particular pattern. Some only have motor fibers and others are mixed. That means they have a combination of sensory and motor fibers in them. Oftentimes, they're associated with head, neck, and facial regions, with the exception of one, which is sort of the grand poobah of all the nerves, which is the vagus nerve, number 10. This goes into the neck, into the visceral organs to control those. And so this is basically what they look like. So you can see from 1 to 12, we're going to basically here's basically your olfactory nerve, which is basically controlling your sense of smell. Number 2 is the retina of the eyes. So basically that's one's controlling the retina of the eyes. Number 3 is your eye muscles. So you can see this one coming out here. That's going to control the muscles in your eye. Number 4 is also another type of eye muscle control. So that's this little guy right here. Number 5 is basically your mouth, your deep face, right? Your mouth and your jaw muscles, your teeth nerves as well. So that's basically going to be number 5. That one's coming out right about here. You can see there's 3 branches of that one coming out here. Number 6 is going to be going after the eye muscles, catching a theme here. There's a lot of eye muscle cranial nerves here. Number 7 is going to your taste buds and the facial muscles and your glands. Number 8 is going to be going into your inner ear. It's called the vestibular cochlear. Number 9 is called your glossopharyngeal, basically glossotongue, pharyngeal, throat. So this is going to your pharynx and your under your tongue muscle. Number 10, which is this guy right here. So this is your vagus nerve. This controls your visceral organs. 11 is basically going to the neck and the back muscles. So that's called an accessory one. And then the tongue muscles, which is basically going to be another group of nerves going to the tongue muscles. So you have different regions of your tongue that are being controlled by cranial nerves. Okay. So spinal nerves basically are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Remember, this is the one that is caused by the confluence of the dorsal root and the ventral root. So the cell bodies associated with the dorsal root is essentially going to be your sensory system. So that's your posterior or dorsal root, and that's going to have that dorsal root ganglion in it, which is a big processing center for all the sensory information coming in. And your ventral root contains your motor fibers, which is essentially going out to the rest of your body to signal to the rest of your body to contract or do something of that nature. And then, of course, this brings us to your somatic system, right, which basically is a part of your nervous system that serves the skin, the skeletal muscles, and the tendons. And so not all motor actions are voluntary. Some are automatic. For instance, reflexes tend to be automatic. We already talked about those a little bit. So we take a look at the reflex arc. This is essentially where you're going to get a stimulation going through the ventral root, through the interneurons. It's not going to go up to the brain itself. So the nerve central signals are going to basically go directly to the motor neurons and out to the effector. That's kind of what it looks like. So for instance, here you get some sort of a sensation that's critical, oftentimes life-threatening. That sensory information will come in to the dorsal root ganglion, and basically it'll go into the interneuron, which is this purple guy right here. It's going to be processed by the interneuron, which is then going to relay the response directly to the ventral motor neuron, which will then go through the ventral root out to your muscles for you to contract your muscles. You're not going to wait for the brain to make a decision here. This is a reflex, but you are going to send the message to the brain to let them know what you just did. So that's just kind of a recapitulation of the reflex system. The autonomic system then is kind of like basically in charge of unconscious events. So this basically regulates things like cardiac, smooth organs, glands, right? Things that basically are on autopilot. This is going to be controlled by what's called your autonomic system. And so typically in your autonomic system, you can divide this further into subdivisions. One is called the sympathetic division and then the parasympathetic division. And what they do is they create different responses. Both are involuntary. Both basically innervate the internal organs. And typically they will use neurons and ganglia to move their impulses forward. So this is kind of what it looks like. So first of all, the blue piece is essentially what's called acetylcholine. And so this one is the parasympathetic. This is your rest and digest, remember. And then the red one is going to be your sympathetic. This is your fight or flight. So what's going to happen is notice that basically what you have is along your system. We're going to take a look at the parasympathetic first. You have the vagus nerve, which is communicating, has multiple branches in your vagus nerve, which will basically innervate to, say, for instance, the heart, which will basically slow the heart down, or it will basically innervate with the lungs, which will have the effect of constricting the bronchioles to slow down your breathing, or it will stimulate your gallbladder or your stomach or your pancreas. It'll also stimulate your intestines in a couple of different places, both small and large. At the tip, you'll have other nerves that come out and basically stimulate your bladder, your reproductive organs, or your rectum. And so these are all part of your rest and digest. So notice what they also do is they will connect, there are a couple of others that will connect parasympathetically to your eyes, your eye musculature and movement, or to your tongue for your sense of taste, and also to your salivation. So these are all part of your parasympathetic. Remember, parasympathetic is rest and digest. On the sympathetic side of things, what you have is a slightly different construction. You have this huge thing here, the big ladder right alongside the spinal cord called the sympathetic chain ganglia, where these are all processing centers that basically form this like ladder-like parallel structure going down the spinal cord. So what you have is essentially a pre-neuron, right? So essentially that's going to go to a particular ganglion, a sympathetic chain ganglia, and then from there it's going to have another neuron that's going to go to the organ of choice. In this case, you can see that it's going to go to the lungs to increase breathing, go to the trachea, it's going to go to the heart to speed the heart rate up. In some cases, these ganglia are going to go and they're going to be relayed through another ganglion like this guy right here. And these are going to be then further regulated and distributed through the digestive system. For instance, this is going to go to the liver to stimulate liver production, or it's going to go to the kidneys to stimulate kidney production, or it's going to go to the pancreas or the stomach to increase stomach production, or to shut down stomach production, rather. It inhibits the kidneys, and inhibits the stomach, and inhibits the pancreas. And then the other thing is also that's going to do, and PowerPoint's about ready to crash on me here. I'm almost there. Come on, PowerPoint, you can do this. Right, so basically what's going to happen is you're going to essentially shut down a lot of the rest and digest functions. You're going to shut down your bladder, inhibit the bladder. You're going to inhibit the reproductive organs. You're going to inhibit your digestive system. And then that's going to prepare you for running for your life, right? Fight or digest, or fight or flight basically means you're running for your life. You're not resting and digesting. Rest and digest basically means that what you're doing is you are essentially at rest, you're safe. And then what's going to happen is you're just basically digesting and sort of doing all that sort of work. That's your rest and digest, your parasympathetic. So if you're at rest right now and you're relaxing, you're in parasympathetic mode. If you typically jump out of an airplane, then you're going to be stimulating your sympathetic division. That's your fight or flight, right? Your adrenaline rush. It's your stress. It's your stress, right? Your survival strategy. That's basically what we're talking about there. And so those are those two. So you have your fight or flight and your rest and digest. So sympathetic basically is where you have your preganglionic fibers. That is to say, your sympathetic chain ganglia. Basically, they'll come from the spinal cord. They'll end up in the ganglia that lie near that cord, that sympathetic chain ganglia, and that's your preganglionic fiber, which is typically short. The one that comes out of that ganglia is long. So for instance, these guys are long. These guys here, the blue ones, are short. That's what they're talking about here. And so ultimately, this is happening during emergency situations, stress situations. You either have to fight or you have to take flight. You have to run for your life. Typically, what's going to happen is it's going to increase your heartbeat and dilate your airways. It's going to get your system infused with glucose and oxygen so you can run and contract, but it's going to basically shut down your digestive system. Now's not the time to digest your food. It's going to shut down your urinary system, your reproductive system. Now's not the time to do any of that. Now's the time to run for your life. So the neurotransmitter in charge of all of this is going to be the adrenalins, norepinephrine in particular, epinephrine as well. So the structure of norepinephrine is similar to epinephrine, which is your adrenaline. This basically is what's going to fuel your fight or flight response. So basically rapid breathing, high heart rate, all those stress-induced types of symptoms that we associate with are part of that sympathetic division. Parasympathetic division basically has fewer cranial nerves. Oftentimes the preganglionic fibers are long. The postganglionic fibers are short. So here's basically what it looks like here. So notice this is basically long. So here's your preganglionic fiber. This postganglionic fiber, which this guy right here, is short, and oftentimes it's located in the organ itself. Okay, so basically what's going to happen is this guy is going to promote responses associated with a relaxed state. And so digestion of food, for instance, slows the heart rate, you're at rest, and this is basically where your sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system takes over. That's why we call it the rest and digest. The neurotransmitter at play here is acetylcholine. So this is the one that will slow your heart rate down, slow your breathing down, and so forth. So here's kind of like a look at it in terms of your somatic motor pathway, your sympathetic, and your parasympathetic. So somatic is voluntary or involuntary. Typically, there's one neuron involved. Cranial nerves, oftentimes, and the spinal nerves are involved in this one. Typically, they'll use acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter, and you are essentially targeting skeletal muscles. In terms of the autonomic motor system, the sympathetic is associated with involuntary movement or type of control. You have essentially two ganglionic, shorter, and the postganglionic, which is longer. Two types of nerves involved in there. And then you typically will have the motor fiber, which is generally from the spinal nerves. The neurotransmitter involved here is norepinephrine, and usually you're going to target involuntary, smooth, cardiac, muscles, glands, things like that. So the autonomic, the parasympathetic is also involuntary. In this case, flip around. So you're going to have preganglionic, which are longer than the postganglionic, and you're going to use the same types of nerves, cranial nerves, for instance, or primarily the vagus nerves and some sacrospinal nerves. You're largely using a neurotransmitter here. And you're going to be targeting similar sorts of things as your sympathetic, only in this case, you're going to be slowing everything down and kind of getting everything back to rest. And so that's basically what's happening with those. Okay. Let's go ahead and take a look at the very last piece that we have for the chapter, and that is basically the neurotransmitters. As a matter of fact, the way that we basically design drugs or the way that drugs act on us. So first of all, we have to start off with the neurotransmitters. So we have acetylcholine, which is one of our primary neurotransmitters, essentially for, this is important not just for musculature, but it's also important for memory circuits, so building memory as well. We have norepinephrine, which is important for dreaming, waking, and mood. So that's an important piece. Dopamine, which also regulates mood, and it also helps coordinate your movements, right? So for instance, oftentimes a dopamine deficiency can create a Parkinsonian type of a presentation. Serotonin is involved in thermal regulation, sleeping, emotions, and perception. So depending on what you're doing, that basically can have an effect on any one of those. And GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter that inhibits, there's inhibitory that works in the central nervous system. So there's, in addition to neurotransmitters, there's also what's called neuromodulators. So neuromodulators will basically be, they'll modify or attenuate a neural response. to a transmitter. So think of a neurotransmitter as kind of like I'm excited or not, right? So a neuromodulator is one that kind of qualifies, well, how excited are you? Or how inhibited are you? So it basically creates a variation in the strength of the response. And that's how those work. So for instance, substance P is a type of neuromodulator that's released by sensory neurons, and it's typically released when pain is present to reinforce that signal. Endorphins are a type of neuromodulator that blocks the release of substance P, and so these are natural painkillers. And so we do, like opium, for instance, is a type of endorphin mimic. Excuse me, morphine, which comes from opium, is a type of endorphin mimic. That's the reason why it's oftentimes used for pain management. So when you take a look at drugs, for instance, what are some of the common modes of action? Oftentimes what drugs will do is they will basically either increase the amount of neurotransmitter in the synapse. For instance, Xanax, Valium, they increase GABA, which basically is an inhibitor for anxiety. So you inhibit anxiety by basically increasing the inhibitor for that particular neural response. And so when you have reduced levels of norepinephrine or serotonin, that's typically linked to depression. So Prozac increases their levels. And in Alzheimer's, oftentimes you have loss of memory. So drugs, like for instance, acetylcholine will allow acetylcholine to accumulate in the limbic system, which will help to increase learning. Why? Because when you take a look at learning, learning is a complex gamish, right? So not only do you have sensory information coming in that you link to particular pieces of information that you're learning, so you basically get that smell trigger or that visual trigger that helps you remember a fact, but you also have an emotional response. That's where your limbic system comes in. So oftentimes, if we can emotionally attach ourselves to a particular piece of information, we're more likely to learn it faster because you're incorporating the limbic system. And so if you're able to stimulate the emotional connection to an Alzheimer's patient, then it helps them to be able to remember better. Another way they'll operate is by the decretion or the decrease in the action of neurotransmitters. For instance, an antipsychotic drug, for instance, will be used for schizophrenia, which is associated with dopamine activity. So there's too much dopamine in the system, and so it'll decrease that dopamine. Caffeine basically will decrease the inhibitory neurotransmitters in the brain, creating an excited state. This is why you get the jitters, right? Where caffeine becomes a stimulant. And so other ways you can do this is by either replacing or mimicking a neurotransmitter. So basically you look like a neurotransmitter. And so this is like a neuromodulator, for instance, opiates like codeine, heroin, morphine, they bind to the endorphin receptors basically because they look like endorphins. And so what they do is they trigger that endorphin response, they reduce the pain, and they produce those feelings of well-being, which is what becomes addictive to individuals, so-called riding the golden pony, as I've heard some individuals who are a bit more street savvy than me describe it as. So when you start to get to substance abuse and substance use, oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes dopamine is kind of at the center of the brain's reward circuit, right? So the reward idea is associated, it's there, it's designed to create better learning with positive association. That's why it's there, right? So if you learn something, you're rewarded for it, and then ultimately that stimulates better learning, right? So for instance, there's groups of neurons that promotes this kind of healthy, kind of pleasurable activities, things you enjoy to doing, such as eating. Eating is a good thing because it keeps you alive. Instinctually, your body rewards you. It makes you feel good when you eat because you need nutrients and energy. Oftentimes, however, when you take drugs that artificially stimulate that reward circuit, oftentimes to the point where they'll actually neglect the basic physical needs in favor of continued drug use, then you start to get into some dangerous patterns where you really start to distort and kind of co-opt the normal pathways, and you start to create problems. Oftentimes, abusers will display very psychological and or physical types of dependencies on drugs because of this. Your body's adapting to this increase in pleasure adaptation or to the physical dependence on a drug's effect. And so your psychological dependence will basically come across as cravings. So you basically have the need to actually take this drug, a desire, a strong desire to actually take this drug. And a physical dependence is when your body's physiology has become tolerant or expectant of this drug. And so what's happened is when you have a physical dependence, you've sort of rewritten normal homeostasis. To cause imbalance. It's kind of like physiological dysfunction, right? One of the things I used to say is like, to a dysfunctional person, functional looks dysfunctional, right? To a dysfunctional physiology, functional looks dysfunctional. And so this is basically where you get to withdrawal symptoms, because what's happening is your physiology thinks that the drug-induced physiology is what normal should look like. And when you take the drug away, then you go through a physiological shift where all of a sudden now your physiology is thinking it's in trouble because it's a kind of dysfunctional view of what normal physiology should look like. So you're kind of rewriting your normal homeostasis, which is really, really bad news. And so you have to oftentimes be careful with how you come down off of drugs. And so here's basically some different types of common drugs that we see. Alcohol is a suppressant, which you typically drink. Nicotine is a stimulant, which you typically smoke. Cocaine is a stimulant, which you can either snort or inject or smoke. Methamphetamine or ecstasy are stimulants, right, which you can smoke or you can take them in pill form. Heroin is a depressant. Oftentimes you can either inject it or smoke it, or you can snort it. And marijuana, or K2, which is a manufactured marijuana mimic, is psychoactive, considered psychoactive, so you can smoke it or you can actually eat it as edibles. So those are different types of situations that can happen to the nervous system. And that finally is the end of chapter 14.